All right, we are in this first lesson, our second lesson actually, our second handout, and we are getting into chapter 1. Anybody else need a copy of that lesson that we're on today? Lesson number 2, Hannah, Samuel, Eli. We have one or two down here too, Ken. As we get into our discussion of chapter 1, we barely scratched the surface of that. We began to talk about some people that we were reading about even in the first 8 verses. Let's refresh our memory by reading chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. Now there was a certain man from Ramathaim Zophim from the hill country of Ephraim. His name was Elkanah, the son of Jehoram, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, the Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man would go up from his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice to in Shiloh. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests to the Lord there. When the day came that Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and her daughters. Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had closed her womb. Her rival, however, would provoke her bitterly to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. It happened year after year, as often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she would provoke her, so she wept and would not eat. Then Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep, and why do you not eat, and why is your heart sad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? So we have our introduction to Hannah, and her husband's name was what? Elkanah, very good. And we have them from the location of Ephraim. And Kevin was discussing with me, there's something important about that since he is Levitical descent, remember the Levites didn't receive a tribal inheritance. They were scattered in 48 cities all around Canaan land in all the different tribes. So even though he's from Ephraim, he is still Levitical in his ancestry. So that's why he is able to serve the city that he does to God. So now, 2 wives. One of them was Hannah. What was the name of the other one? Peninnah. That is the wife, the other wife. Also in her role. He served as a priest. He also served as a judge. So Eli in sort of a position as, and Eli has 2 names. All right, we have Phinehas and Hophni are his 2 sons. And we have are caught up in our place for the stop class. We see his family, his wives, they're making yearly trips to Shiloh, of at the time. And so this is people today who might show up in worship service on Christmas or Easter. It's not my purpose today to go into all that, but this is not that. This is a requirement of God year. And when we talk about worship service today, the gathering of the saints is every first day of the week, not once or twice a year. So God's required something different in the New Testament. Now in this time era, there was a requirement at this particular time to come. So every year he would make the trip that God required. Now why do you suppose he had 2? I say suppose because we don't know. Hannah was barren, and sometimes if a wife was barren, they would remedy that by having a second wife. Have an heir, someone to inherit. And that had to do with their land allotment, so on. So he has he has two wives. I don't know why the Bible doesn't tell why he has Hannah and Peninnah. We have to sort of guess at that, but the barrenness of Hannah might have something to do about it, to do with it. The Bible does tell us there's something special said about Hannah that he doesn't say about Peninnah. What specifically about Hannah? He loved her. Doesn't say that about Peninnah. I mean, he doesn't love her, but it specifically said about Hannah in verse 5. Now, what do we know about the relationship of Hannah and Peninnah? What do we know about their relationship? What is it? Adversarial. This is not a happy home. This is not everything's great and everything's going wonderful. This is not happy at all. They are, verse 6, they're rivals. And a rival is a troublemaker in the other person's life. And then there's three words that follow that word rival in verse 6, and they describe the actions and intent of Peninnah toward Hannah. Notice word number 1 is provoke. Word number 2, bitterly. Word number 3, irritate. She provokes her, is intensified, irritate, having to do with humility, to irritate her, humiliate her, taunt her, and she has a tool by which she does that. And what's the thing that she on? The closed womb of Hannah. Look at all these sons and daughters that I have, and you don't have one. Why? Because the Lord's closed your womb. And she taunts her over that, and she irritates her, and it's a bitter kind of thing. How often and when in particular did Peninnah do that? When they went yearly to Shiloh. Can you imagine that? Year after year, verse 7, when they went to worship, when they went to sacrifice, when they made this yearly trek to Shiloh to worship and sacrifice to God, and that highlighted the issue. And then Elkanah gives a double portion to Hannah, and that would highlight the issue even more. But every year, can you imagine that somebody would wait until you're ready to go to worship? And that's when they would begin to taunt and irritate and poke and cause trouble. What's that do to your heart when you want to worship God? That's pretty hard, isn't it? Have you ever come to church that way? When I say come to church, that's accommodative language. We understand church is the people, not the geographic location. Church, coming to gather with God's people, Sunday, the first day of the week, Wednesday night Bible class, whatever it might be. That's where you're going, that's where you're headed, and that's when the fight begins. You ever come to church that way? It's hard, isn't it? Some just turn around and go back home. Guess what the preacher can't do? I can't do that. But if you've ever come to worship God that way, you can't sing, you can't pray, hard to take the Lord's Supper. It just makes everything so difficult. The heart's not right. So this is when Peninnah chooses to start poking and prodding in particular. And Elkanah tries to comfort Hannah. How's he try to comfort her? Well, the double portion and the words. What words does he offer? Don't I love you more than 10 sons? Don't I love you more than 10 children? Don't I love you enough? Is that the problem? That's not the problem. His love for her is not the problem. The problem is She wants children. She can't have children. She's barren, and that's the struggle she's having, and that's what's going on between her and Peninnah. That's the focus of the issue, and that's the struggle she's having in her heart and in her relationship in the home to Peninnah. This is the problem, and he's offering a solution that really doesn't address the problem. He's doing what all husbands want to do. They want to solve that. They want to make it all better. They want to make it go away. But that's not even what the real problem is. He can't fix that for Hannah. He just can't fix that for her. But he tries. He loves her and he wants to comfort her, but the words don't help. The double portion of the sacrifice, it doesn't help. It's still there. Now, I think there are some good lessons in this that we need to at least touch on before we move on to the next part. Judy? So supposing they didn't all live in the same room, under the same roof, very possibly so. You see that kind of relationship with Rachel and Leah as they're battling over Jacob. So you're saying, all right, is this an opportune time for her to get to her? Probably so. Probably so. Good observation. That is an opportune time for her to get to her. Would they have been in the same area with one another all year long? Yeah, they would have been on the same, property and the same environment and all that, but a particular time to get to her where there's a special closeness between them and they can be together in the same place face to face and have to deal with each other in that close proximity, sure, that would offer that kind of opportunity. Good point. Anything else? All right. Then some lessons that I think we need to think about before we move forward is something to admire in Hannah. She's barren. It doesn't say anything about how Peninnah came to be in that relationship. But it also doesn't say the same kind of thing that it says with Sarah. Sarah, when she was barren, offered her handmaid to her husband Abraham. Hannah's answer is not that. Wherever Peninnah comes in, that's not Hannah's answer to it. Hannah's answer is, I'm going to go to God in prayer. I'm going to do that regularly. I'm going to weep before my God. I'm going to ask and petition Him for a child. That's how Hannah answers that. Not like Sarah did. So I think there's something of great value there in how Hannah is answering this struggle in her life. She not only is going to go to God in prayer, but she's going to make a vow concerning the baby boy she's going to have. She makes a vow to God asking for a child. So Hannah's answer is a very godly one. Sarah's was not. And then we have Elkanah, who has this second wife. And I don't know if that was because one was barren or not. But whatever it was, we learn Elkanah going to Shiloh every year. He's basically a godly man, but he is inconsistent. And someone might say, well, back in that day and time, didn't they customarily have 2 wives or 3 wives or whatever? Wasn't that more of a custom of the day? Yep. Yeah, you read about that quite a bit. Was that ever God's way? No. Garden of Eden. A man, a woman, husband, wife, leave and cleave. The end. That was God's way. After the Garden of Eden, it's not too long, and you see a man by the name of Lamech taking 2 wives. That's the first time that occurs. And it's in a context of sin, of drifting away from God. It's in that family line of Cain that happens. And then it happens more prevalent as time rolls on, just sort of floating into the customs of the time. It was accepted. but not by God. It was never God's way. And every time somebody violated God's design for the family, it always introduced struggle. And so we have that situation coming up, and even though he's basically a godly man, he is inconsistent. He loved Hannah, he gave her gifts, but this second wife added to the problem. It didn't solve it. It just changed the problem. It actually made it worse than it would have been. So you have this yearly trip to Shiloh, and worship was a difficult thing for Hannah, and this is something else I think we need to admire about her. If she knew that year after year, Peninnah would attack her on the way and at the worship site of Shiloh, that she would be at her and taunting her and irritating her and being bitter toward her, she knew that worship for Hannah would have been a struggle emotionally, spiritually. It wouldn't have been a happy time for her. Did she go? Yep, she went. She went anyway, even though there was that emotional pain. Today you'll find some times that people will be wounded in some way. And because of that wound, because of that emotional pain, because of that struggle, they'll stop attending the assemblies of God's people. It might be a personality clash with a member of the church. It might be the loss of a spouse, and we've been there for so many years, and I just can't be in that room anymore. I can't sit there without him or without her, without thinking about that. It's too much emotional pain, and they stop coming. Or some kind of friction with somebody. And they're struggling with that. And their answer is, I'm just not going to go anymore. But I also want to notice this. When Hannah went to Shiloh, that's also where she found her answer to her struggle. And when we remove ourselves from God's people, we remove ourselves from that sphere in which He answers and helps. That's something to consider when we are in emotional pain. Stopping attendance, not going to the assembly, not being a part of things, not being a part of what God requires. That's not where you're going to find the answer. She found her answer in that painful place because it's where God resided. It's where He was working in the midst of His people. So she went through all of that to get to the answer, and it was worth it in her life. Other comments or lessons you think of with Hannah in these first several verses we've talked about? Okay. All right. Note to Bob. Okay. All right. So Sandy is making a point here, a contrast between the two women. Peninnah's focus seems to be opportunity to get at Hannah. Hannah's focus seems to be God. And so the focus of the women seems to be different. I saw another hand somewhere. Yes, Ron. Okay, Ron brings up sometimes people sort of vacate the premises of the Lord's church. They just stop attending long time ago because of some friction, some problem, and now it might be, who knows, maybe a decade or two later, you still can't get through to them because they're hanging on to that, they've harbored that, and they're not allowing themselves to get past it. Should never stop coming, because you can't let what one person or a handful of people do that might be wrong to bar you from the presence of God and doing what God wants you to do, and to learn to let them deal with that and let God deal with them. So sometimes we still deal with that today, trying to reclaim those who've fallen away many, many years ago, and they're not allowing themselves to get past some friction or problem with somebody. It's usually a person or two. And they have done the opposite of what Hannah did. Think about the blessing coming to Hannah here. It's really important. All right? Then we are going on to verses 9 through 18, and we will begin to look at that. Then Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She, greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come on his head. Now it came about as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli was watching her mouth. As for Hannah, she was speaking in her heart, only her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. Then Eli said to her, How long will you make yourself drunk? Put away your wine from you. But Hannah replied, No, my Lord, I'm a woman oppressed in spirit. I've drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, for I've spoken until now out of my great concern and provocation. Then Eli answered and said, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your petition that you have asked of him. She said, Let your maidservant find favor in your sight. So the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. First question, how should we understand the beginning of verse 9? Then Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. How should we understand that? You may not even know what I'm asking. They had a meal. Was Hannah eating and drinking at the meal? Probably left because of sorrow. Okay? So look back at verse 8. Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep, and why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Then in verse 18, so the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Now, the beginning of verse 9, then Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Who has a translation other than the New American Standard Update that I just read? Who has a different translation? Randall? And you will find that in many other translations. She arose after they got done eating and drinking. So she is there, she is polite. You ever do this at your house with the little ones? They don't want to eat this, they don't want to eat that, they don't want to eat the other thing, and they want to jump up from the table while meal is still in session. And you say to them, no, you're not going to play, sit here at the table till we're all done. You ever do that? This is, those must be the days that Matt's cooking, I'm guessing. But anyhow, that is something that I grew up with. Okay, you're done eating, you don't want to eat all that. Number one, our next meal is about 5 hours away. So you're not going to eat in between. If you want something to eat, you eat what's on your plate. That was one rule. And the other one was, you sit here till we're all done. And I think Hannah is doing what is polite, courteous, and expected. Others are in the middle of their eating and drinking at Shiloh, and she is there, she is present, and she is there but not eating and drinking. She is in too much grief and sorrow and pain, and she doesn't feel like doing that. She is almost in a place of fasting while this is going on. So we need to understand verse 9. It's when they had finished eating and drinking. She wasn't participating in that, though she was present and she was there. And then in verses 7 and 8 and verse 18, you have a reference later then to her eating and drinking after her prayer is answered. Now we want to take a little peek into the heart of Hannah while all this is going on. 5 times you're going to have her refer to herself as the maidservant. Maidservant of the Lord and to the high priest. Your maidservant. She refers to herself that way 5 times. Verse 11, verse 16, and verse 18. And then something else we see with Hannah is her reference to God. There is one reference to God that's different. And I'm reading particularly in the New American Standard Update. Your translation may be a little bit different. But I want you to look in verse 9. Do you have the word Lord at the end of verse 9? Who has that? Is it Lord? And how are the letters? They are what we would call small caps. These are capital letters. And usually what a Bible translation does is when the word Lord is in small caps, it's telling you that is that Hebrew term Yahweh. This is that reference. And you will find that verse 9, Lord. Verse 10, Lord. Verse 11, twice. Verse 12, again. Verse 15, again. You have that several times there. 6 times in those verses, you have her referring to Yahweh or God in that terminology. Then there's another reference in verse 17 that's just God, G-O-D, but not in those small caps. Hebrew term. It would be associated with the term Elohim in that verse. So you have her referring to God 6, 7 times there in this passage we just read. She's the maidservant of the Lord, maidservant of the priest. She refers to God multiple times over and over again. And then after she gives birth to Samuel in chapter 2, there is a song of praise and thanksgiving of Hannah, and you'll find it 9 more times in that song of praise. God is filling her life. This is her thought process. This is where her heart is at. Her heart posture before God and toward her problems is so instructive. It's so very different than you hear a lot of times today. Things were miserable in her life. And when that happens today, a lot of times you hear people pointing a finger of blame at God. If there's a God, why not this and why not that? What kind of God would put me in this situation? And this attitude of entitlement. You owe me. And if there's a God, then you need to be doing this for me. She's not like that. She's the maidservant of God, and her life is filled with God and respect and reverence for God, and she treats it that way. She approaches the problem that way, but not arguing or demanding. So I think all of those are good points to remember about Hannah's heart posture toward God in this problem. Now she's going to make a vow in verse 11. What kind of vow is she making about this boy child that she's asking for? Going to give him to the Lord all the days of his life. And what will never touch his head? A razor. What would that be associated with? Dedication.
Sort of like the
It's sort of like the Nazarite vow. And where would we find information about the Nazarite vow? Where's that sort of spelled out for us? Number 6, very good. So that is the passage. If you want to read about the Nazarite vow, go to Numbers chapter 6. And the razor not touching the head that's part of that vow. You'll also find that in Judges chapter 13. What judge will we be talking about in Judges chapter 13? Samson. He was a Nazarite from birth. And that was part of what was supposed to be attached to Samson. Remember when he cut his hair, that was a great violation. That was the end of it. So this is very similar to a Nazarite vow, if not a Nazarite vow in particular, that's taking place here. She's vowing, I'm going to give him to the Lord all the days of his life. There was a temporary Nazarite vow and there was a permanent Nazarite vow. And so this is permanent in nature. All the days of his life, I'm going to give him to the Lord. And I think that is another instructive point about all of this. I thought about Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4. I think about that verse often. That in the fullness of time, here comes Jesus, born of a woman of law, in the fullness of time. And this is all of history from Genesis 1:1 all the way through, all of it adding up to what we would call the fullness of time. Fullness here is a word that means if you are filling, for example, a bottle, here's my bottle of water, but I can look and I can see the top of the water in this bottle. There's some room left. It's a brand new bottle, but I can see some space in there. I could open this up and I could put more water in it. Fullness of time, that word fullness means there's not one more drop that would fit in. It is absolutely filled up to the very top. That's when Christ was born. It was the exact right time. And you could add up a number of things that make that so. And we've done that in other classes. Looked at things in history that added up to the perfect timing for the birth of Christ. And I thought about that with Hannah, and God is going to answer her prayer. He's going to give her this baby boy that she's been praying for, but she has made a vow. So all of these years, year after year, Hannah's going through this struggle. She's being taunted by Peninnah. She's in misery. She's barren. She's more than anything. And finally she gets to this point. Lord, if you indeed look on the servant and remember me, and not the servant, but will give your maidservant, then I will give him to the Lord all his life. In the fullness, God granted her request. What brought her to the point of that vow? What brought her to the point of making that vow to God and being ready to give Samuel, her little baby boy, to the Lord all the days of his life for the significant role that he would play in the history of the nation of Israel? What all that brought her to that? All difficulty, all those years of unanswered prayer she went through brought her to this, to be ready to want that baby boy for the right reason. And God granted her prayer request. We need to think about our own struggles and our own prayers, our requests of God, and how God will sometimes postpone those answers. And the way that He asked for prayer at all. That we don't. And when He answers those prayers, He does the exact to want to the right reason. This is something, you'll notice this. He became 8 days old. They would circumcise him. There was a period of vacation for a boy. I believe that was about 33 days. At about day 4, they went to him in the temple. That's the firstborn belonged to God. What's for one? Well, do they satisfy a longing, an emotional in us, fulfilling of a family? Yes. I mean, and they're part of the qualifications of elders and deacons. But the reason I'm talking about is spelled out in Ephesians 6, please. Ephesians 6. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. It is to give that child to God. And to bring that child into the environment of God, God's family, His church, as soon as possible. Sometimes people want children for an ego thing. Wrong reason. Give them to God. That's the right reason. And Hannah, when she was ready to make that vow, that's the time. Now you're going to have an answer. This is more than about Hannah and filling up her personal need. This is about giving this child to God. Something very wonderful about the timing of the answer of that prayer. Other thoughts, other ideas, comments? In that particular way, if you will go to Luke. If you'll go to Luke chapter 2 and look at that text, where they are bringing Jesus to the temple to present Him to the Lord, there should be a cross-reference in your Bible that will take you back about the firstborn that opens the womb. It doesn't mean that's the only one that is, in a sense, dedicated to God, but there was like the first fruits of the crops, first fruit of the womb belonged to God. And they were to ransom that one. Look it up. Yeah, we're at the end of our buzzer. I think if I remember right, it's specific about the boy, but I could be wrong about that. But I'll ask you to read that. There are some wonderful things in this text, and the birth of Samuel and the answer to prayer, and how ready she was to serve God with the birth of that child. Would you think for next week about how it would be after she weaned that baby boy to deliver Eli, and then how tough would that be? And how special was that garment that she made for him year by year? Think about that. Read some in 1 Samuel, and we'll be ready for class next week.